I always believed my family was perfect, until the night my stepson whispered words that shook my world forever. His gaze lingered, his voice trembled, and in that fleeting moment, everything I thought I knew about my life unraveled. What started as an innocent request for a towel turned into something I couldn't comprehend, something I couldn't ignore. How did I get here? For most of my life, I lived a simple, fulfilling existence. My name is Laura, and I took pride in being a devoted wife and stepmother. My husband, Mark, and I had been married for years, and though our marriage wasn't perfect, it was steady. Mark had a son, Ethan, from his previous marriage, and over time, I came to love Ethan as if he were my own. Ethan was 20 years old, vibrant and full of dreams for the future. He brought a refreshing energy into our home, a reminder of the days when I was that age, with the world at my feet. To him, I was more than a stepmother. I was his confidant, someone he could turn to for advice and comfort. We had our routines, mornings with coffee and casual banter, evenings filled with laughter over dinner. It was a comforting rhythm, one I believed would never change. Our home was modest but warm, filled with memories of quiet weekends, family holidays, and small moments that made life meaningful. Ethan often filled the space with his optimism, his chatter about college, his jokes that never failed to make me smile. Mark and I, though not overly affectionate, shared a mutual respect that kept our relationship steady. I never had reason to question any of it. Life was predictable in the best way. Until one night changed everything. That Saturday evening, Mark was out with friends, leaving just Ethan and me at home. It wasn't uncommon. We had spent plenty of evenings together, watching TV or chatting over tea. I had no reason to think this night would be any different. But that evening something shifted. It wasn't an event or a confrontation, but a subtle change in the air. A look, a moment, something unspoken yet undeniably present. I didn't want to dwell on it at first. I tried to push it out of my mind, convincing myself it was just my imagination. But the truth was my once perfect, predictable world was starting to crack, and I didn't know if I'd ever feel the same again. At first, I dismissed the unease as exhaustion or an overactive imagination. Life had been busy, Mark was working longer hours, and I had been juggling the usual household responsibilities. I told myself there was nothing wrong, but the truth was, I started noticing little things that I couldn't quite explain. Ethan began to linger around me more than usual. It wasn't obvious at first, just subtle shifts in our interactions. He'd ask more questions about my day, or his gaze would linger a moment too long during casual conversations. It wasn't enough to alarm me, but it was enough to leave me wondering. One evening, while Mark was out again, I was in the kitchen preparing dinner. Ethan came in to help, something he hadn't done in years. He brought over a stack of dishes and set them on the counter, giving me one of his warm, familiar smiles. "You've been quiet lately," he said, his tone curious. I froze for a moment, stirring the pot on the stove to hide my reaction. "Oh, just a lot on my mind," I replied casually. But when I glanced up, his expression was serious, his eyes searching mine as if trying to read my thoughts. "Is there anything I can help with?" he asked, his voice soft but sincere. The question caught me off guard. Ethan had always been kind, but there was a different tone to his voice that night, something that felt deeper, more personal. "No, I'm fine," I said quickly, hoping to end the conversation. But as I looked at him, I saw a flicker of something in his eyes, concern maybe, or something I couldn't quite place. It left me unsettled. The days that followed were no better. Ethan's behavior, though subtle, became harder to ignore. He'd find reasons to be close to me, brushing past me in the hallway or sitting unusually close on the couch during our evening TV shows. And then there were the looks. Those long, lingering glances that seemed to hold unspoken words. I couldn't tell if I was imagining it or if he really was acting differently. One afternoon, I walked into the living room to find him sitting on the couch, a book in his lap. When he noticed me, he smiled and patted the seat next to him. "Come sit, Mom. Let's talk." I hesitated. There was something in his tone that made me uneasy, but I didn't want to overthink it. I sat down and we started chatting about his classes, his friends, the usual topics. But as we talked, I realized he wasn't really paying attention to the conversation. His focus was entirely on me. His questions were personal, his tone gentle, almost intimate. And then, out of nowhere, he said it. "You look really beautiful today, Mom." The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. My breath caught, and I felt my face flush with heat. "Ethan, that's very sweet of you to say," I stammered, trying to keep my voice light. He gave me a small smile, but there was something in his eyes that I couldn't ignore. I mean it, he said softly. I quickly changed the subject, desperate to break the tension. But the moment stayed with me long after our conversation ended. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't stop replaying his words in my head. I told myself it was nothing, just an innocent compliment. But deep down I knew better. The next few days were filled with the same subtle, but unmistakable shifts in our interactions. I began to feel a strange tension whenever Ethan was around. His presence, once comforting and familiar, now felt charged with something I couldn't name. I started questioning everything: his behavior, my own feelings, the unspoken connection that seemed to be growing between us. I didn't want to believe it, but I couldn't deny it any longer. Something had changed, and I wasn't sure if I could ever go back to the way things were before. As much as I tried to deny it, there was no ignoring the growing tension between Ethan and me. The once innocent bond we shared had shifted into unfamiliar and unsettling territory. I wanted to believe it was just my imagination, but with every passing day, the moments we shared felt heavier, charged with emotions I didn't know how to handle. It was a quiet evening when everything seemed to shift. Mark was working late, leaving Ethan and me alone again. I was sitting in the living room, a book in my lap, but my focus was elsewhere. My thoughts were scattered, my emotions tangled. I didn't even notice Ethan enter the room until he spoke. "Hey, Mom. What are you reading?" His voice was soft, almost hesitant. I looked up, startled, and quickly held up the book. "Oh, just a novel. Nothing exciting." He smiled and sat down beside me, close enough that I could feel the warmth of his body. "You've been reading a lot lately," he remarked, his tone casual. "Everything okay?" I nodded quickly, avoiding his gaze. "Of course. Why wouldn't it be?" Ethan didn't respond right away. Instead, he leaned back against the couch, his arm brushing against mine. It was such a small thing, but it sent a jolt through me. I tried to ignore it, but the air between us felt thick, almost suffocating. "You know," he said after a moment, his voice low, "you've been different lately. Quieter. Distant." I froze, unsure of how to respond. "I've just had a lot on my mind," I replied carefully. "Is it me?" he asked, his gaze intense. "Did I do something to upset you?" His question caught me off guard. I turned to face him, surprised by the vulnerability in his expression. "No, Ethan. Of course not. Why would you think that?" He shrugged, his eyes dropping to his hands. "I don't know. It just feels like something's changed between us." I opened my mouth to respond, but the words wouldn't come. Because he was right, something had changed. And as much as I wanted to deny it, there was no escaping the truth. "I don't know what you mean," I finally said, my voice barely above a whisper. Ethan looked up at me then, his eyes searching mine. "I think you do, Mom," he said softly. The room felt unbearably quiet. I could hear my heartbeat pounding in my ears, feel the heat rising in my cheeks. I wanted to say something, anything, to break the silence, but before I could, Ethan reached out and took my hand. The touch was gentle, hesitant, but it sent a wave of emotions crashing over me. I should have pulled away, should have said something to stop whatever was happening. But I didn't. I just sat there, frozen, as his thumb gently traced the back of my hand. "You mean so much to me," he murmured, his voice trembling. "More than I think you realize." My breath caught in my throat, and I felt tears prick the corners of my eyes. "Ethan, we can't," I began, but my voice faltered. "I know," he said quickly, his grip on my hand tightening. "I know it's wrong, but I can't help how I feel. You're not just my stepmom, Laura. You're everything to me." The words hung in the air, heavy and impossible to ignore. I wanted to argue, to tell him he was wrong, but the truth was I felt it too. That connection, that pull, it was undeniable. And in that moment, I realized just how much I had been suppressing my own emotions. "Ethan," I whispered, my voice trembling. "This isn't right." "I know," he said again, his voice barely audible. "But it feels right." I looked at him, then really looked at him, and for the first time I saw the depth of his feelings, the vulnerability, the longing. It was overwhelming, and it terrified me. But it also stirred something inside me, something I couldn't ignore. Without thinking, I reached out and brushed a strand of hair from his forehead. It was such a small gesture, but the intimacy of it made my heart race. Ethan leaned into my touch, his eyes closing briefly before meeting mine again. "I don't want to make you uncomfortable," he said softly. "But I need you to know how I feel." I nodded, unable to find the words to respond. My mind was racing, my emotions a whirlwind of fear, guilt, and something else, something I didn't want to admit. For the rest of the evening, we sat in silence, the unspoken tension between us growing with every passing moment. I told myself that it was just a fleeting moment, that it didn't mean anything. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. The days that followed were filled with more of those moments, stolen glances, lingering touches, unspoken words. Every time Ethan was near, my heart would race, my resolve would falter. I knew it was wrong, knew I had to put an end to it. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't stop myself from being drawn to him. It was as if we were caught in a storm, powerless to resist its pull. And as much as I wanted to fight it, a part of me didn't want to let go. A part of me wanted to see where this forbidden path would lead, no matter the cost. It happened on a quiet Saturday evening, the kind of evening that usually brought comfort and routine. But this time everything felt different. Mark was out of town for a work conference, leaving Ethan and me alone in the house for the entire weekend. I told myself it was just another ordinary night, but deep down I knew better. The tension that had been building between us was reaching a breaking point, and I could feel it in every breath, every glance, every unspoken word. I was in the kitchen, finishing up the dishes after dinner, when Ethan walked in. He leaned casually against the doorframe, his arms crossed over his chest, watching me with that same intense gaze that had become impossible to ignore. "Do you need help?" he asked, his voice soft. "No, I'm fine," I replied quickly, keeping my eyes fixed on the sink. I could feel his presence behind me, close enough that I could sense his warmth. My hands trembled as I scrubbed at a plate, trying to focus on the task at hand, but my mind was racing. "Laura," he said, his tone more serious now. "Can we talk?" I froze, the plate slipping from my hands and clattering into the sink. My heart was pounding in my chest as I turned to face him. "About what?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He stepped closer, his expression earnest and vulnerable. "About us," he said simply. I felt a wave of panic wash over me. "Ethan, there is no us," I said quickly, my voice shaking. "You're my stepson. This whatever you think is happening, it's not real." "But it is real," he insisted, his voice rising with emotion. "You feel it too, don't you?" "I can see it in your eyes, Laura. I can feel it every time we're in the same room. Don't tell me you don't feel the same way." I opened my mouth to argue, but no words came out. Because he was right. As much as I wanted to deny it, I couldn't. The feelings I had tried so hard to suppress were written all over my face, and there was no hiding from them now. "Ethan, this isn't right," I said finally, my voice trembling. "It doesn't matter how we feel. We can't do this." "Why not?" he asked, his voice raw with desperation. "We're not hurting anyone. Mark doesn't even care about you the way he should. I see the way he treats you, the way he takes you for granted. You deserve better than that. You deserve someone who sees you, who values you." I shook my head, tears streaming down my face. "This isn't about Mark," I said, my voice breaking. "This is about us. And what you're talking about, it's wrong, Ethan. It's wrong." He stepped closer, his hand reaching out to gently touch my cheek. "It doesn't feel wrong," he whispered. "It feels like the most natural thing in the world." I closed my eyes, tears spilling onto my cheeks. I wanted to pull away, to put an end to this once and for all. But instead, I found myself leaning into his touch, my resolve crumbling with every passing second. Before I knew what was happening, his lips were on mine, soft and tentative at first, then growing more insistent. I should have stopped him, should have pushed him away. But I didn't. Instead, I kissed him back, my hands tangling in his hair as the kiss deepened. It was like a dam breaking, all the emotions I had been holding back flooding to the surface. The warmth of his body, the softness of his lips, it all felt so right, even though I knew it was wrong. My heart was racing, my breath coming in short, shallow gasps as we clung to each other, the rest of the world fading away. But then, the sound of the front door opening shattered the moment. "Laura? Ethan? I'm home." Mark's voice rang out, startling us both. We pulled apart quickly, our breaths ragged, our faces flushed. Panic surged through me as I realized what had just happened. And what could have happened if Mark hadn't come home early? Ethan stepped back, his eyes wide with a mix of fear and regret. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "I didn't mean for this to happen." I nodded, unable to speak, my mind racing with 1,000 different thoughts. I turned back to the sink, trying to compose myself as Mark entered the kitchen. "There you two are," he said cheerfully, oblivious to the tension in the room. "How's everything been while I was gone?" "Fine," I said quickly, my voice unnaturally high. "Everything's fine." Mark didn't seem to notice my unease. He walked over and kissed me on the cheek, then turned to Ethan. "Hey, buddy. How's it going?" Ethan forced a smile, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. Good, he said quietly. Everything's good. The rest of the evening passed in a blur. Mark chatted animatedly about his trip, completely unaware of the storm brewing beneath the surface. Ethan and I avoided each other's eyes, the unspoken tension between us almost unbearable. When Mark finally went to bed, I let out a shaky breath, the weight of the evening crashing down on me. Ethan lingered in the living room, his expression unreadable. "We need to talk," he said quietly. I nodded, my heart heavy. "Not tonight," I whispered. I can't do this right now." He hesitated, then nodded. "Okay," he said softly. "But we can't just ignore this, Laura. We need to figure out what this means." "I know," I said, my voice barely audible. "But not tonight." He gave me a small, sad smile, then turned and headed upstairs. I watched him go, my chest aching with a mix of guilt, fear, and longing. I didn't know what the future held, but one thing was clear. Nothing would ever be the same again. As I stood there alone in the quiet of the living room, I felt the weight of my choices pressing down on me. I had crossed a line I never thought I would, and there was no going back. The question now was how to move forward, and whether I could live with the consequences of what we had done. The days following that night were a blur of emotions and avoidance. Mark carried on as though nothing had changed, blissfully unaware of the turmoil brewing beneath the surface. Ethan and I, however, were a different story. Every interaction was laced with tension, every shared glance a reminder of the line we had crossed. I tried to throw myself into my routine, desperate for some sense of normalcy. Cooking, cleaning, errands, anything to keep my mind occupied. But it was impossible to ignore the weight of what had happened. Every time I saw Ethan, I was reminded of the kiss, of the way my heart had raced when his lips met mine. The guilt was suffocating, yet there was a part of me that couldn't bring myself to regret it. Ethan, on the other hand, seemed unable to keep his emotions hidden. He became more withdrawn, his usual easygoing demeanor replaced by a quiet intensity. He would linger in the kitchen while I cooked, his eyes searching mine as though trying to find the answers to questions neither of us could ask aloud. One evening, after Mark had gone to bed, Ethan found me in the living room. I was sitting on the couch, staring blankly at the TV, when he walked in and sat down beside me. "We can't keep pretending this didn't happen," he said softly. I didn't look at him, my eyes fixed on the screen. "I don't know what you want me to say," I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. "I want you to be honest with me," he said, his tone earnest. "About how you feel. About what this means." I turned to face him then, my chest tight with emotion. "How I feel doesn't matter," I said, my voice trembling. "What happened between us, it was a mistake. It can't happen again." He frowned, his brows knitting together in frustration. "You don't mean that," he said. "I know you don't. I see the way you look at me, Laura. I know you feel it too." I opened my mouth to argue, but the words caught in my throat. Because he was right. As much as I wanted to deny it, I couldn't. The feelings I had for him were real, and they terrified me. "This isn't about what I feel," I said finally, my voice breaking. "This is about what's right. And this isn't right, Ethan. You know that. But it feels right," he insisted, his voice filled with desperation. "I don't care what people would think, or what the rules say. I care about you. I love you." His words hit me like a punch to the gut, leaving me breathless. I looked at him, tears streaming down my face, and shook my head. "Ethan, you don't understand what you're saying. This can't happen. It'll destroy everything." "What if it doesn't?" he asked, his voice softening. "What if it's worth it?" I couldn't answer him. The truth was I didn't know. I had spent my entire life playing by the rules, doing what was expected of me. The idea of throwing all of that away for something so uncertain was terrifying. And yet, a part of me couldn't help but wonder. What if he was right? What if it was worth it? Before I could say anything else, the sound of footsteps on the stairs broke the silence. We both froze, our heads turning toward the doorway as Mark's voice called out. "Laura? Ethan? What are you two still doing up?" Ethan stood quickly, putting distance between us as Mark entered the room. "Just talking," he said casually, his tone giving nothing away. Mark looked between us, his expression curious but unconcerned. "Well, don't stay up too late," he said with a chuckle. "We've got a big day tomorrow." I nodded, forcing a smile as Mark leaned down to kiss me on the forehead. "Good night," he said, giving Ethan a friendly pat on the shoulder before heading back upstairs. As soon as he was gone, Ethan turned to me, his expression pleading. "Please, Laura, don't shut me out. I don't know how to go back to the way things were." I looked at him, my heart breaking at the pain in his eyes. "We have to try," I said softly. "For Mark's sake. For all of our sakes." He nodded reluctantly, his shoulders slumping in defeat. "I'll try," he said quietly. "But I don't think I can forget what happened. Or how I feel. Neither could I." In the weeks that followed, things between Ethan and me remained strained. We tried to act normal, but the undercurrent of tension was impossible to ignore. Every shared glance, every accidental touch felt like a reminder of the bond we couldn't acknowledge. Mark, oblivious as ever, continued on with his routines, completely unaware of the cracks forming beneath the surface of our family. It was a strange, painful dance, one that left me feeling trapped between guilt and longing. I knew we couldn't go on like this forever. Sooner or later, something would have to give. But for now, all I could do was try to hold the pieces together and hope that somehow we could find a way to move forward without tearing everything apart. The days stretched into weeks, and though life appeared to return to normal beneath the surface, nothing was the same. Ethan and I tiptoed around each other, avoiding any prolonged moments of intimacy or conversation. Mark, blissfully unaware, continued to be his usual self, distracted and distant, consumed by work and his own routines. From the outside, we looked like the same family, but inside, I felt like I was slowly unraveling. Every time I looked at Ethan, I was reminded of what had happened, of the feelings I had tried so hard to suppress. It wasn't just the guilt that haunted me, it was the longing, the ache for something I knew I couldn't have. I had crossed a line, and there was no going back. But the question that kept me awake at night was whether I could live with the consequences, or if I would always wonder what could have been. One evening, after Mark had left for another weekend work trip, Ethan found me in the living room. I was sitting on the couch, staring blankly at the TV, my thoughts a whirlwind of confusion and regret. He sat down beside me, leaving just enough space between us to keep the moment from feeling too charged. "Laura," he began softly, his voice hesitant. "I've been thinking a lot about what happened. About us." I swallowed hard, my chest tightening. "Ethan, we can't do this again," I said quickly, my voice trembling. "Whatever you're about to say, please don't." He shook his head, his gaze steady and sincere. "I know," he said. "I know it can't happen again. But I can't pretend it didn't happen either. And I can't pretend I don't feel the way I do." I turned to face him, tears welling in my eyes. "You think this is easy for me?" I asked, my voice breaking. "You think I don't feel the same way? But we have to move on, Ethan. We have to." He reached out then, taking my hand in his. His touch was gentle, but it sent a wave of emotion crashing over me. "You mean so much to me," he said softly. "And I know I'll never stop caring about you. But you're right, we have to let this go. For Mark's sake. For all of us." His words, though painful, were exactly what I needed to hear. I nodded, squeezing his hand tightly as the tears spilled over. "I'm so sorry, Ethan," I whispered. "For everything." He gave me a small, sad smile. "Don't be," he said. "You've given me more than you'll ever know. And I'll always be grateful for that." In the days that followed, Ethan and I made a conscious effort to put distance between us. It wasn't easy. Every glance, every shared moment felt like a test of my resolve. But slowly, we began to rebuild the boundaries we had broken, to find a way back to the relationship we had before. Mark never suspected a thing. To him, we were the same family we had always been. And in some ways we were. But in others, everything had changed. I had learned a hard lesson about boundaries, about the consequences of letting emotions take control. And though I would always carry the weight of what had happened, I knew I had to move forward, for myself, for Ethan, and for Mark. Looking back, I realize how easily one moment of weakness can change everything. It's a reminder of the fragility of trust, of the importance of boundaries in relationships. And though it's a lesson I learned the hard way, it's one I'll never forget. Ethan eventually moved out, starting a new chapter of his life in a different city. We stayed in touch, but our conversations were brief and casual, an unspoken agreement to keep the past buried. As for Mark and me, our marriage continued, steady and predictable as ever. But deep down, I knew things would never truly be the same. In the end, I was left with a choice, to dwell on the past or to learn from it and move forward. I chose the latter, because as much as I regretted what had happened, I knew it didn't define me. It was a chapter in my life, one I had to close in order to find peace. And so I let it go. If you were in her position, what would you have done? Could you have resisted temptation, or would the lines have blurred? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear from you. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories that challenge the boundaries of love, loyalty, and the unexpected twists life throws at us. Stay tuned, because the next story will leave you speechless.